as with all things in the world of climate tech, and climate finance, is all of these numbers, they are huge in a vacuum and a drop in the ocean, right? The theoretical requirement is $4 trillion a year for clean tech and renewables. It's currently at 1.7. So that's a gap of $2.3 trillion, which means this $7 billion fund, as enormous as it is by any regular standard, is less than 1%.
Welcome to Wicked Problems. I'm your host, Richard Delevan.
It felt like there was a huge buzz from the founders that are going out there. I sort of felt perhaps it wasn't met by people on the ground, as in this dynamic with Europe. There was a huge enthusiasm from the European founders heading out there. I felt like perhaps local players were looking more at Asia, Africa than Europe.
The future system is going to be much more integrated than the system that we see at the moment. At the moment, we have a transmission system that powers the country at a high voltage level, and then there's a distribution level that sits underneath that feeds our homes and our businesses. These two systems are going to communicate an awful lot more with each other in the future, and they will have to, because our consumer behavior is changing and our business behavior is changing.
A reporter I got to chatting with at an event last week joked that at this time of year in London, you literally could spend your days going from one climate tech focused event to another without ever getting time to write any of it up. He was only half joking. In this episode, for May 17th, 2024, this Climate Week in Review, we've got two parts: a panel discussion with the amazing Freya Pratty from the FT-backed Sifted, just back from a reporting trip to the Gulf, and another one to Helsinki, and Prashant Rao, London-based senior editor for Semafor. Prashant also happened to be the one who made the joke. Sort of proving his point, yesterday I recorded with them while waiting to slip into another event, Politico's Energy and Climate Rammed Summit in Prince Philip House, off the Mall. The Politico event was very good, despite the absence of anyone from the opposition Labour Party. And while only one confirmed the reason on record for their disappearance, they said they objected to speaking at an event sponsored by the Norwegian energy giant Equinor, which, while it does deploy lots of offshore wind, will also be developing the controversial Rosebank oil field. And we'll come back to that. At an earlier event, InnovationZero, I caught up with Laura Fleming, country director for Hitachi Energy in the UK, who had just spoken on a panel about the future of the UK electricity grid. Full disclosure, and in the spirit of making sure that future guests are armed with this information, I do some consulting with Hitachi Energy, though not directly with Laura, and I think her comments were notable and play into the larger debate I heard a version of across all the events I've been at over the past month. How do we accelerate the energy transition and adapt to climate change? What innovation will drive it? Will those innovations be investable? You can judge for yourself and let us know. Feedback at info@wickedproblems.uk or on the usual coordinates and social. Or if you're a member of wickedproblems.earth, tell us what you think in the comments. Now, here's our panel discussion with Freya and Prashant. I speak to you both from the beautiful Prince Philip House on Carlton House Terrace. Much to my surprise, at another event today, but Prashant Rao from Semafor and Freya Pratty from Sifted. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be back.
So yeah, Freya, returning champion, back newly from the Middle East, and a side trip to Helsinki on her way back, or after bouncing from London and back there. So we're so happy you're back safe in London, and good to see you. So let's crack on. We're going to talk about a couple of the stories of the week. You both have fresh newsletters out, hot off the virtual press this morning. We wanted to do a couple of topics that are both stories of the week and things that come up often. So last week, some listeners may know, I was and Prashant was at the Climate Impact Summit in London. Perennial topic is, where does the money come from for the climate tech startups? And in fact, later stage funding becomes harder and harder, and hearing stories about woes in the valley of death. So I guess if we have our favorite subjects, the carbon removal sector, which is barely a sector, but generates a lot of headlines, but struggles a lot with off-takers, which does impair their ability to later on bring in later stage funding. So I thought that one interesting take on that was something that Prashant, that you'd written about a scoop involving KKR and what they're planning to do with some of their gajillions of cash. Any thoughts about whether that's going to help the Valley of Death?
The story was the KKR's global head of climate strategy, co-head of global climate strategy, says that they want to target this valley of death, that according to Reuters, they're raising a $7 billion fund. Yes and no, because as with all things in the world of climate tech, and climate finances, all of these numbers, they are huge in a vacuum and a drop in the ocean, right? The theoretical requirement of funding, if you take the IEA's estimates, is $4 trillion a year for clean tech and renewables. It's currently at 1.7. So that's a gap of $2.3 trillion, which means this $7 billion fund, as enormous as it is by any regular standard, is less than 1%. And so, yes, it's good. And I think KKR has a symbolic value because it's KKR that they are doing this. And they're not the only ones, obviously. TPG is doing it. Others doing, I think Macquarie has raised like a big fund as well, or is in the process of raising a big fund. So they're far from alone. But, as with all these things, just I think the human mind boggles the scale of the challenge. And so we can be both hopeful and in despair with all of this stuff.
Yeah, it was a similar topic, the valley of death, the gap in capital. It was interesting. So some stats came out from the conference that looked at the amount of debt raised by Nordic climate tech companies in Q1 was the same figure, or had just surpassed the entirety of that sum for 2023. So there was a lot of discussion about debt, and a point was made that there's a lot being raised, but where does the next portion come from? And so there were people representing commercial banks on the panel I was on, and they were saying frustratingly they didn't feel like their companies were comfortable yet with underwriting the amount of debt needed. So then there was some discussion on if state banks would come in and fill the gap. And I think there are some perhaps early discussions on vehicles like that. So yeah, it was interesting. Debt was the main topic, which I think is the main topic in a lot of ways at the moment. And in that way, I think the Nordics is leading, partly because of Northvolt's H2 green steel with those huge checks. But yeah, it's still a kind of unresolved question.
And I think H2 Green Steel is a good example because, again, they lined up a bunch of off-takers before really kind of getting too far down the track, as I remember from your reporting, Freya, and I think yours too, Prashant. But I mean, that seems to be the big difference. If you have the off-takers lined up, then you're going to be in a much better position because you know that eventually you're going to continue to be able to operate.
Yeah.
So,
and they can also rely on that whole Swedish conglomerate of companies. So citing that they're started by the same backers as Northvolt, I think is enormously helpful for them. But they are in themselves have done great things.
So Prashant, I mean, one of the things that I think comes out of this as well is that we are entering this cycle where we are experimenting with different funding models. I don't know what your impressions were talking to people at the Climate Impact Summit last week, but it seemed to me that like there is a sort of everyone out standing around looking at each other going, yep, you've got some money, right? But what about, we can raise some debt from you, right? And everyone else wondering if that's in fact going to be true. And you do hear sort of worries that particularly sectors like carbon removal, which would get a lot of attention, that you could wind up seeing some pretty savage consolidation happening not too long in the distant future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are a couple of other challenges, right, that I think certain VCs will talk about, which is it may be that actually, not to dispute the notion that there is a valley of death, but this idea that there's not the financing. There is this argument that I keep hearing, which is I think I have some sympathy for, which is you kind of need a different kind of CEO in a climate hardware company, a different kind of CFO. Because if you have a valley CFO, the sort of unit economics of the valley, and look, Gary Gay talked about this in my interview with him, it's just different, right? You have zero marginal costs. You can actually have the famous kind of, the VCs love to talk about the J curve or whatever, right? Like the hockey stick growth, all this kind of thing. But because that is not there, yes, that does create this value of death problem because as everyone knows, like I'm sure all your listeners know, like you get to this point where capex requirements are so high and you got to get revenues, etc. But if you have a CFO who is in theory comfortable with, who worked in, I don't know, the chemicals industry, right? And understands that like the ways you de-risk, again, using the jargon of the industry, the ways you de-risk is to get some offtake ready, but also like de-risk via your staff. Maybe you don't have offtake ready, but your sales team is not from Meta, but is from BP because you work in a chemicals adjacent industry. And I think there's a little bit more sophistication coming in about this, that like, yes, there's a lack of funding, but if we're going to compete for this limited funding, the way we attract it is by de-risking on multiple levels. And offtake is one, but actually I think there are several in which creating interesting new funding models, right? Like let's say you operate a battery facility, which is high capex, heavy on hardware, right? A couple of people have told me like, what if we started a system, and I think there's some experimentation with this, it's not like unusual or like kind of breaking news here, where, one of your anchor investors owns the facility and pays you a service fee. You own the company, and that allows you then to have a regular cash flow of this facility bringing you a service fee. And you can then, on subsequent projects that you launch, they become an anchor investor in the project. So you create this unusual financial situation, but you're bringing in some cash flow. Interesting and kind of quasi-innovative ways. But I think if you talk to people who work in chemicals, who work in Greece, who work in the kind of old-fashioned, boring oil and gas kind of sectors, they've done this stuff before. And that's why Gary Gay is also kind of fascinating to me, the guy at KKR, because he is not a private equity guy. He was at Schneider Electric for 31 years. He was in an engineering company, and KKR was very explicit. That's one of the reasons they hired him.
Wow. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's something that, Freya, you're reporting and talking about the infrastructure startup is relevant for that in the sense that it's the scale. It's a totally different model. And having people with that background, like you said, the CFOs. I mean, one of the companies that I think we've discussed separately before is Zenobē, which is KKR backed. And in fact, it does feel to me like their financial modeling that they did, their engineering for this, is what's allowed them to be able to get as far as they've gotten, pivoting a couple of times, but also having that kind of showing an early way towards annual recurring revenue that would allow bankability for project finance, that would allow for further lines of credit. And that seems to have made a big difference. Of course, another player, just to transition to our second topic, is people who are sitting in this weird middle space, who aren't necessarily private equity, who aren't necessarily a strategic or not necessarily a VC, but this weird and wonderful world, which happens to be focused in the Gulf, that involves these philanthropies, these nonprofits, which occasionally are kind of a front end for a sovereign wealth fund. And so I was involved in the launch in COP26 of the Qatar Foundation-led initiative joint venture with Rolls-Royce, which put in a substantial amount of money, we understand, for developing a climate tech accelerator campus in the north of England and a satellite in Doha. And in working with the guy who was putting that together on how to talk about this, and we had a long conversation about patient capital and where that sits in the stack. And it'd be interesting to see if there is more of a move towards some of these players becoming even LPs in more traditional funds in the West, where they're part of the stack. It gets messy, but it'd be interesting to see how that goes. But that brings us to Freya. You've just returned from a reporting trip for a couple of weeks in the Gulf. Tell us, what was it like?
Yeah, on the Qatar point as well, I've been trying to get an update on the Qatari Rolls-Royce project. I don't know what's happening with it at the moment. So if anyone knows, I'd love to hear. I feel like we're awaiting news perhaps. But yeah, Dubai. So I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. It was a whirlwind trip. The whole place is very kind of fast-paced and slightly crazy feeling. But it was super interesting. So Sifted's remit is covering European tech companies. So while I was out there, I was meeting the European companies that are going there to deploy their technology. And there are a lot of them. So things that are obvious: desalination technologies, carbon capture, vertical farming tech. It felt like there was a huge buzz from the founders that are going out there. I sort of felt perhaps it wasn't met by people on the ground, as in this dynamic with Europe. There was a huge enthusiasm from the European founders heading out there. I felt like perhaps local players were looking more at Asia, Africa than Europe, but that was an interesting dynamic. And yeah, they obviously just have huge, deep pockets to fund these mega projects, and they want climate technologies to work there. So one company I spoke to is the Swedish company Einride, which makes autonomous trucks. They're building a huge road between the different Emirates, which I imagine is a massive contract and hard to find something of a similar size in Europe. So yeah, it was a super interesting trip. There's obviously big concerns over they're still pumping out oil. Do these technologies make any dent? I'm now starting to look at, I don't know if you saw the reporting on NEOM, the Saudi project that came out this week, the human rights concerns with these mega projects. So although it can be like a game-changing contract for a startup, there are concerns that come in.
I mean, there's a famous line from a journal piece covering NEOM, consultants going in from the West, and the saying that get passed on in the reporting was, you go to NEOM with two buckets, one to fill with gold and one that gets filled with shit. And whichever gets filled first, that's when it's time to go. And that's basically seems to be true for both the consultancies who are making absolute bank off of a lot of Gulf states, but also startups who are hoping to get some of that sweet liquidity. So what was the story this week, just to remind the listeners?
So the BBC had an investigation. It was someone who'd previously been in the Saudi military who'd come out and publicly said that they were given an order to use lethal force to remove villagers from the area where they're building the line project. I think the Saudi government have themselves said that I think it's 6,000 people have been removed from the land, but this added onto that story. And there are people detained in Saudi from protesting those evictions. So yeah, there's already one company that's cut ties with NEOM, this British desalination company. I spoke to their founder earlier today. He said, yeah, we couldn't do it anymore. I'm trying to get answers from some of the other European companies that have deals with NEOM, but I know their hands are probably tied and they can't come out and say anything. So yeah, it's a real tricky one. I met a few climate investors in Dubai who were so excited about any company that had anything to do with NEOM, because obviously, as I said before, it's such a big contract. It's equivalent to like 20 small contracts in Europe. So it's game changing, but extremely, extremely complex.
Right. And I mean, it's a Prashant, and some of your earlier reporting, and again, you had some things today actually about the projections for the Saudi kind of incorporation of renewables in their kind of energy generation mix over the coming years in your newsletter and Semafor today. And I think also you had earlier written a couple of stories about the kingdom's push into mining in general, strategic minerals, critical minerals, as we say, for the transition. So tell us a little bit your impressions about what play the kingdom, the Emirates, and others in the region are making in this space.
Yeah, look, I don't claim to be any kind of expert. It was a short trip, and largely because Semafor is later this year, like launching our Middle East section, and we're getting that ready. I think speaking to the Saudi Deputy Minister for Mining, it was pretty clear. It's part of their Vision 2030 outlook is that eventually of their kind of industrial pillars, of which I think oil and gas and petrochemicals are two prior ones. They want to make mining the third. And I think prior sort of Gulf, but particularly Saudi sovereign wealth investment was largely ensconced in domestically or in the near environs. They are, exactly as Freya said, looking to more quote unquote adventurous locations. In some cases, in seeking a higher return. So, the public investment fund, I think like between a fifth and a quarter of their investments are outside of the MENA region and have a mandate only to deliver high returns. Whereas I think the remaining 3/4 to 80% has a strategic patience and is more ensconced in the MENA region. I was talking to the Deputy Minister for Mining, and very clear, like there is this sense that Saudi Arabia will position itself as, they call it, I think they have some terminology for it where it's like the greater subcontinent of mining that stretches from Central Asia down to Africa. I mean, something of a questionable geological construct, I think, but at the same time, I think the openness to sort of start pumping money overseas. The Saudi state mining investment arm, Manara, has, I think their biggest initial investment is in Vale and a Vale mine. And so they have gone actually pretty far afield. And there is increasing kind of strategic look at what kind of minerals they believe they will need to support the various kind of clean energy industries that they want to invest in, notable among which is electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. And so you're talking about like copper, lithium, an array of others, because at the moment, I think largely the ones they have are not conducive to the kinds of mineral processing they would like to be involved in.
Finally, I know, Freya, you've got a hard stop coming up. But I think just the third topic we wanted to just briefly touch on is we're in the political year of all political years. None of us is a full-time professional political prognosticator, so I'm not asking you to fill those roles. But obviously, both in the U.S., the elections coming up for the European Parliament, here, as well as whatever is going to come out of the process in India about the same time the European Parliament vote starts opening. Lots in flux in the U.S. Good old friend Donald Trump has come out fighting against wind, and has, according to Politico and according to other sources, has basically said, to the oil industry, if you give me $1 billion, I will shut down all of the policies of the Biden administration. Now, putting aside the political part of it, I mean, what does that do to investor confidence and the confidence of startups? Because we've written and seen stories about how many startup founders in climate tech are being sort of sucked in, and indeed bigger investors, sucked into the tax incentives for the projects in the States. Does this surely at the moment people are just wondering, given where the polls are, was any of that a good idea? And B, are you getting any signals that people are just kind of holding fire now until they see what happens? So Freya, maybe you go first if you have a thought.
Yeah, a lot of founders I speak to are just saying they want stability and the ability to make a long-term decision, which this year is extremely tricky for. In the UK, I felt like there's been, for the last year or so, there's the companies I cover are cozying increasingly up to Labour in that way. So Octopus Energy is a big company on my beat. They are very in there with Labour. I think Green Lithium, the company up in the north, is doing similar moves. So yeah, I feel like there's a lack of stability and people are just trying to make inroads with who they think the winners will be. But in terms of big moves, I have noticed there was a company in Oxford that said they'd moved to America, and I haven't heard anything about that for a while. So I think there might be people waiting.
I think the bigger, like, I guess it's like trying to disaggregate some of the sort of kind of countervailing issues, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, for all of whatever criticism others may have of it, has created inbuilt lobby groups because of the number of jobs it has created. It has created voting blocks. It has created industrial associations that have some measure of power. Now, they are arguably not as powerful as fossil fuels are at the moment in the United States, but the relative delta between those two groups is very quickly closing. So I think I suspect the median outcome in a Donald Trump presidency, in my sense, is not that the Inflation Reduction Act is repealed, but that the bureaucratic apparatus that doles out the various kind of Treasury, DOE, all of those, like the bureaucratic apparatus that kind of structures the Inflation Reduction Act, jiggershot, those kind of people, that will be gutted, right? And that you can expect that the review of DOE grants will slow. The guidance that is issued by Treasury will slow. Maybe it'll be less open to certain kinds of technologies. But we see, for example, in Georgia is a great example of this, right? Georgia has sort of pioneered this notion of like state level deregulation and federal largesse, and combining those two to become real, like it's like now it's become cliche to say, but it is like overused fact that red states have benefited more financially from the IRA than blue states have. And so there is, even within the Republican caucus, I think, a lot of reticence towards repealing the IRA. Now, that's one thing. I think the other thing that is worth sort of thinking about is this notion of when Donald Trump, the $1 billion promise that he said that that would actually be good value, because of the Post reported that he said it would be, quote, a deal because he would provide such generous incentives. I think that may well be true, but also, so there are, again, two kind of countervailing things. Like the direction of travel is very clear. I think when you talk to the bigger the investor, the more confident they are that, look, this is like the clear direction we're going in. But there are, I think, among the biggest investors, if you talk to major corporates, they're extremely reticent to make bets in which the business model is based on tax incentives. If the business model itself does not have the sort of economics in which it can be profitable, then you have to ask questions. And that is actually like good economics, good sort of business planning. And that is where I could see it being affected.
I think I would agree with that almost entirely. And I think it's going to be, in conversations I've had with people trying to reshore critical minerals processing, say exactly that. I've been saying this the whole time. They need to keep on both sides of the aisle, and they need to make sure that the economics don't rely on the tax incentives. That's nice to have, but they can't make it work otherwise. Now, Freya, I know you've got a hard stop, but again, big shout out for your newsletter. It's Sifted. Again, fresh edition today. Very excited. Anything else you want to plug before you head off?
No, just the newsletter. Keep reading that, and I'll keep doing some reporting on the Gulf the next few weeks, and then probably back to normal proceedings, focusing on Europe. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Freya. And Prashant, if you can stay on for another minute or so, I'll talk about this Tesla story this week. Thanks to Freya, who had to stop at that point, and Prashant, who we continue with later on in the podcast. But for the moment, here's a bit of an ad break. And when we come back, we'll have my interview with Laura Fleming, the country manager for the UK and Ireland for Hitachi Energy, friends of the show. So stay tuned.
Hey, here are some ads to help pay the bills. If you'd prefer a version without ads, subscribe to our member feed at wickedproblems.earth. A monthly subscription is cheaper than buying us a pint.
And we're back. I should add that we did record this interview live at InnovationZero, and you can hear that very clearly in the background. But we think hopefully it was a conversation worth bringing to you. Let us know your thoughts. Laura Fleming, Managing Director of UK and Ireland for Hitachi Energy. Thank you for joining us on Wicked Problems here at InnovationZero.
And thank you for having me.
You're fresh out of coming from one meeting to another, a busy day, buzzy place here, the Olympia. Very loud in the background, so we'll have to do some later to make sure that everyone can hear this clearly. But you were on a fantastic panel about the future of the grid here in the UK earlier today. Tell us a little bit about some of the points that you made about what the future system is going to look like and what is going to be required to get us there.
Yeah, thank you. So the future system is going to be much more integrated than the system that we see at the moment. At the moment, we have a transmission system that powers the country at a high voltage level, and then there's a distribution level that sits underneath that feeds our homes and our businesses. These two systems are going to communicate an awful lot more with each other in the future, and they will have to, because our consumer behavior is changing, and our business behavior is changing as well. And on top of that, we're increasingly relying on renewable energy, which is intermittent. So we're going to be including storage, which will need to go somewhere. So all of these systems will need to speak to each other, and we'll be exchanging information with each other on an increasing basis. In addition to that, the system has also got to grow, because with electricity becoming the backbone of the energy system, we're going to increasingly use electricity to power all of the things that we're doing day to day. So the grid actually needs to grow to double the size that it is now in order to meet that additional demand, even if on balance we try to use less energy. We'll be using more electricity. So on the one hand, we're growing, and on the other hand, we're integrating two fairly separate systems at the moment, and then we wanted to be more flexible. And then thirdly, we also needed to be more secure. So more secure from the point of being able to supply. This is where storage comes in, but also more secure from the point of view, for example, like cyber security and energy security more widely. So it's a very, very complex picture, but one we can definitely do given the right ingredients.
And something I wanted to drill down on, you mentioned during the panel discussion the need for transmission kind of suppliers and operators to better understand the distribution side of things and vice versa. And you've just spoken a little bit about this being a more integrated system. What are some of the examples of what are the kinds of things that would enable that closer integration?
So one of the things that would enable that closer integration is actually the systems to be able to speak with each other and understanding really where the demand is coming from, and understanding clearly where the supply at that point in time then also needs to be coming from, so that the two things can be married up together. So in our energy system, we will have points where we can completely power the entire grid of offshore wind, but the demand might not be large enough in order to soak up all of that energy. Then we'll be looking to store that so that we can utilize it at a later time. The only way we can really sufficiently do that if we understand where the demand is coming from over the next 24, 36 hours, so that demand can be released at the point when we need it immediately.
So it's something that I think that we're hopefully going to be talking to Haley from National Grid about, the demand flexibility trials that have been happening with different operators. And I suppose having the intelligence of seeing some of the results from that, seeing how that's going to actually be operationalized more frequently outside of a pilot program going forward, the kind of intelligence that's going to help your customers to better plan against that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of storage then, I mean, it's something, as you say, all the investment being made in generation. At COP28, we talked about there being a tripling of renewables by 2030, but people very often quickly forget about the other side of the equation, which is not necessarily when you don't have wind or sun shining, but when you have more excess supply of that than demand, and using that in a more intelligent way. So tell us a little bit about what some of your customers are looking at in terms of storage. How much kind of short duration storage, long duration energy storage, is that becoming more of a conversation that you're having with customers, or that they're trying to have with a broader market?
Yeah, definitely. And as you're saying, at those points in time when we're generating more energy than we're consuming at that particular point in time, it needs to go somewhere. And actually at the moment we're seeing an additional topic which is actually generated because of the lack of capacity in the grid, which is where wind farms will be switched off because actually we don't need that power at that given time, which is obviously a real shame not to be able to use that power when we can generate it free without impact on the climate. So in order to stop that from happening going forward in the future, we can store the energy in battery energy storage systems, or giant batteries if you like, but we can also convert the energy into hydrogen, for example, and then store it at a later time, or actually maybe do something completely different with it. For example, power boats in the shipping industry, or maybe for domestic heating if that is going to further develop. Right. And then, as you say, absolutely long duration storage. There are various trials going on to see, okay, how can we actually enable that, and how do you make that part of the entire system, so you can actually balance the system between the supply and demand and keep the carbon-free level in the energy system as high as possible, because obviously that is the aim at the end of the day. We want to use as little actually gas as possible, and that is really the driver that we're going for.
I mean, obviously there are a couple players, I think, down here on the floor who are in the innovators in the long-duration energy storage space. I mean, I think we've spoken to Stephen Crozier from Re-Energize, who's a kind of artificial pumped hydro, not using water, some other stuff that they use to drive it up a hill and then use gravity to drive a turbine, and lots of other innovation going on in this space. I mean, it's something that, is it something that you imagine Hitachi Energy to be playing a larger role in the future in terms of exploring? I know that the company works in some aspects of green hydrogen and some other things. What's on the horizon for you guys?
So what Hitachi Energy does is deliver the systems that will allow the transmission and the distribution system to run. And that goes all the way from the software all the way through to the HVDC equipment, transformers, switchgears, etc. Connecting all the different parts is effectively what is at our core, and then we do a few things that sort of sit on the edge of that, for example, around vehicle charging, those kind of things. Where I really see Hitachi Energy playing is in that system integration piece, and really being able to create the system that is going to work, delivering the power from where it is generated to where it is consumed, and the various steps in between. At the end of the day, losing as little of that energy as possible, because this is another area actually where we lose a lot of our energy at the moment. It's a lot of losses in the system, and we can help reduce those as well.
And the company recently announced a major significant investment on top of a capital program going back a couple of years of $3 billion, if I recall correctly, of another $1.5 billion of transformers to expand capacity globally, about how to make more of that to meet market demand, because things are so tight. How confident are you about the industry's ability to be able to deliver and solve some of these supply chain issues and shortages in transformers and some of these other pieces of equipment in a timely way that's going to enable customers to make this transition in an affordable way?
Yeah, exactly. I think the industry is ready to start scaling up, and the $1.5 billion investment that you heard about is one of those investments where we as Hitachi Energy are getting very strong signals from customers, and that's allowing us to create that additional investment. What is really required there is the signals from the customers, obviously, that they're going to be buying on the one hand, but also the positive investment climate that governments, for example, provide. So we've seen several initiatives with the IRA in the US and the Green Deal in Europe. In the UK, we have now the Giga Fund that a number of people are working on. So these are really positive signals also coming from governments in order to invest in the supply chain. So that is step number one. Step number two is really around the delivery of the projects and the programs, so looking much further ahead and getting a really clear idea in terms of what our customers are needing, when are they needing that, and how we're actually going to deliver that together. So more engagement earlier between ourselves and the customer to deliver those projects together.
final question before I let you go. I know you've got a busy day ahead of you. We've obviously got a lot of political leadership from both major parties represented here today and tomorrow. I think Ed Miliband will be speaking today. Clark Pertino gave a speech about different approaches about how they're going to do this.
Yeah.
What is your message to a government of any stripe that might be in office a year from now in this country? What is it the industry needs from government in order to be able to fulfill some of the goals of the energy transition?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, visibility. So it's visibility that the targets that we have will remain the targets that we have.
Right.
That the people required to implement those targets will be given the tools in order to do so, so therefore the investment that is required to do that. And then certainty around the deliverability of those projects. So this is cleaning up the topics around planning and permitting. This is cleaning up the topic around actually bringing the communities with us and really looking at delivering the projects going forward. So because that together is creating a positive and sustainable investment climate that we really need to deliver those long-term projects and programs that we're looking at now.
Well, I would love to take as much of your time as I could, but I see there are some people who are eager for you to be able to move on to your next conversation. Laura Fleming, Hitachi Energy, thank you so much for joining us on Wicked Problems.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Thanks, Laura Fleming, for coming on the show. And now we resume our conversation with Prashant Rao from Semafor, where we get into, well, some of the most interesting antics of a billionaire that's happened at least this week.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you probably have seen lots and variety of different reporting, but for the benefit of the listener, who if you haven't been taking a close track on this, essentially, and you correct me where I'm falling down here on the facts as far as we know them. So Elon Musk, who in the Isaacson biography was talking to Walter Isaacson for 2 years and was very, very kind of not particularly excited about the prospect of this lower cost new Tesla called the Model 2 that was meant to be priced at about $25,000. And then within the last couple of weeks, Elon Musk was in a meeting with the team looking at very early stuff on their AI-driven Robo-taxi, and then said according to the reporting, the spur of the moment, in this meeting, says we're going to kill the Model 2, which was supposed to be out in a year and flying off the production lines, and we're going to go absolutely hardcore pivot and put everything on AI Robo-taxi, and that'll be the future of the company. And has been signaling to investors that if you think you're investing in a car company, you're wrong. But there's been all sorts of blowback from this. And it's just, I saw this, there's another story, I think, that did the rounds with Leo Kuguan, a Singapore-based billionaire who basically is now signaling that he's going to try to vote against Musk's compensation package at Tesla, partly because of this turmoil that seems to be taking place. So is it just specific to Musk, or is there just something wrong with billionaires who get to this point and decide they can turn an entire kind of company of Tesla's significance on a dime?
I guess one of the underlying questions that we should ask about, I think I would tend to agree with your analysis broadly. I think like one of the questions that I ask myself is like, compared to say 3 or 5 years ago, what is Tesla's significance to the EV industry now? And this is something it is of course significant. I'm being somewhat facetious, but at the same time, sitting as I do in London, there's BYD is going to be a dominant player in Europe, and as are several other kind of Chinese EV manufacturers. The writing seems to be on the wall that they're going to likely be a dominant player, if not the dominant player. But then you see here, like every third car is a Hyundai or a Kia, and more of them are EVs. And yes, everyone's pulling out their EVs in Europe. And increasingly, I think in the United States, you see that maybe slower than we would like in the United States, but at the same time, the US has particular geographic challenges that are not present in Europe, given the sheer size of the country. So I guess like first we should sort of calibrate how much, to some degree, we should care, right? Because 3 or 5 years ago, Tesla was essential to the EV kind of worldview. Like that was what made it accessible, made it nice and exciting to own an EV. And I still think that's true. Teslas are like I rent a Tesla when I rent a car here in the UK, but it is less the case. I think it would be fair to say that it was 3 to 5 years ago. And I guess one of the fascinating things about Musk as well, this kind of cribbing from Ben Thompson's analysis of this, is I wonder, like at a place like Twitter, software has no physics constraints. And so you can kind of tell your engineers, just do this. And there's not really anything stopping them. And at Tesla, like Musk was incredible because he pushed his engineers so hard, and they abutted against, somewhat extreme, but abutted against the sort of ends of physics when it came to electric vehicles and this kind of, and it was such a path-breaking company, and it still is to some degree today, right? And I think one of their struggles now is when you come up against a Chinese EV company that is iterating so fast, that is delivering so many new models all across the sort of the price various across varying price levels, and Tesla has 4 models. It's just, and none of them are regularly updated to a significant degree. They're largely the same car they were 2, 3, 5 years ago, with significant but not like sort of path-breaking updates. I wonder, those are actually, to me, deeper challenges than, or at least as deep, that they face a ridiculously competitive industry now in a way that was not the case 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
I think I buy that, and I think I almost wonder if it's sort of like Elon Musk seeing exactly as you say, BYD is coming. They're going to own the value end of the market. If everyone believes the direction of travel will remain broadly the same, when you retool Detroit, you retool Detroit. It's over. That's it. Either you're going to make ICE engines or you're going to make EVs. And I suppose once you get to past a certain threshold, it's going to be impossible to kind of go back. So where is there any kind of white space for Musk to do the thing he seems to be good at, which is get really excited about something? Unfortunately, of course, that there's an entire engineering team in there and design team who came there to work on climate change, who came there to work there on cool cars. And they're like being told like, yeah, robo-taxi. And they're like, yeah, I'm not feeling it, bro. I mean, like, so yeah, you can imagine there's going to be quite a few people polishing their LinkedIn over the last week, figuring how do I get out of this? Maybe BYD would have me or somebody else. So culturally there's that. But I do wonder if the other aspect of this that is going to be interesting to see how it plays out is we obviously are starting to see, I mean, one of the only things in America that both sides can seem to agree on is that China bad in the rhetoric. So Democrats and Republicans is the only thing they agree on. They're usually completely wrong-headed about their reasons for this, but they think it plays well with voters. And my worry is that if a national champion, which Tesla effectively is for EVs, kind of backs out from important parts of that market that extend it down the kind of the chain into other people, that the potency of an anti-China sentiment becomes even more toxic and potentially ladders up to actually interfering with the progress of the whole project, the whole transition. That'd be something I'm worried about.
That's a great point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. That's correct. I would tend to agree with that analysis. I suppose if you were to look at it, I wonder if like one way to look at that, to say yes and to what you said, is doesn't it to some degree confirm then the China analysis that effectively Tesla has been beaten? And so maybe it would correctly harden sort of sentiment against China, because look, I mean, this national champion, which had some measure of state support, right, through like tax credits and other sort of incentives for consumers, not to the extent of BYD, I don't mean to compare them that way, but that if it can't succeed, that it can, right? And this is a tale that we've seen with the sort of solar panel sector, we've seen with wind turbines in Europe, we've seen with EVs. Exactly. I'm going to plug one of our stories. Our story in our most recent newsletter was about China's battery recycling sector that is likely going to have a leg up on everybody else. This is, I think, we can say that maybe politicians are being doomsaying about China, but to some extent, there is like at least more than a grain of truth to a lot of these concerns.
No, I agree with that. I think it's a question of, I think there's a weird tension that can be healthy, and what people refer to as this race to the top. And it's like you can have virtuous competition within limits. The question is, these things don't often stay in the nice, narrow, happy Goldilocks zone where things are just tense enough, but not so tense that you wind up doing things that damage the entire effort, or both sides wind up being losers. So I guess it's one to watch. Anything else, Prashant, you want to plug, or from today's newsletter, or from Semafor generally?
No, I just love if people could sign up to Net Zero and Flagship, which is our kind of global international newsletter that comes out twice a day. But no, thanks for having me on, Richard. I appreciate it.
Well, we hope you'll join us again sometime, and really appreciate it. I thought this was a great chat.
Thanks a lot.
We'll be back soon.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delevan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.